Emily, can you explain the link between self-harm and stress?
Okay. So the way that I think about self-harm through the research and the work that I've done in the area is that it's not something that's completely separate from the way most of us live. So there's still quite a taboo around self-harm, and I think the general public impression is that it's something that people in great distress do and something we can't relate to. But actually I think the most helpful way to think about self-harm is to think about it on a continuum, on a self-harm continuum if you like, and that continuum is parallel by the amount of stress that we have in our lives. So if you think of that continuum, at the beginning of that continuum where you're feeling your life is going okay, there's no major stresses, things are jogging on okay, you might be at the point where you're kind of self-caring, where you're looking after yourself. Then as more stress creeps into your life, so say for instance there's problems in your relationship or difficulties at work, you might get a little bit more reckless with yourself. So you might end up having a couple of glasses of wine in the evening where normally you just have one with a meal, or you might not exercise, or you might start eating a little bit more or a little bit less. So you get a bit less self-caring. So imagining that continuum is parallel with stress, so that right up at the other end you're at the point where you're feeling so overwhelmed with stress that you actually get to the point where you're more willfully harming yourself. So you're feeling much more reckless, much less caring about yourself. So you might be actually at the point where you purposely injure yourself. That I believe that we all move up and down that continuum. We're not sort of at one point in it and we stay there. Depending on what's happening in our lives, we become less self-caring and move into that point where we're self-harming with drugs or alcohol or dangerous behaviour, or actually self-injury. You can think for yourself, when I'm under stress, what is it that I do that I feel completely compelled to do? I know it's not good for me, but under that stress I feel like I've got no choice. And it's that same mechanism that's going on for somebody that's self-injuring. So I think when we're working with people who are self-harming, or we're parents of children who are self-harming, or we're teachers that we can where we can see our pupils are self-harming, to actually put ourselves in that place, what is it that I do? And to recognise that's exactly the same process that's going on for that young person.
Why is it that the figures have been soaring over the last year or so? I mean, the statistics make for horrible reading.
They do, yeah. Yeah, I mean, even in the last year, statistics have come out that hospital admissions for young people who are self-harming, so obviously at the point that's quite extreme in self-injury, those figures have gone up by 30% in the last year. And we have the highest rates of self-harm in the UK, in the whole of Europe. And there's lots of sort of ideas about why this increase has happened, particularly in young people. That's where the figures are really on the increase. The pressures that young people are under in terms of the social media, the expectations to look a certain way, to behave a certain way, exam pressure, that transition from childhood into adulthood and all the pressures that come with that. There's a big correlation between feeling isolated and self-harm. So teenagers who feel excluded from social groups, feel like they're the odd one out, they're more at risk of self-harm because they're feeling isolated or potentially harassed or bullied. And even compared to the States, we have higher figures here. And the reasons that are kind of touted for that is that the States have much more of a religious structure. So even if someone's feeling quite isolated, they have that sense of belonging, that sense of meaning, often through a religious structure, which is on the decrease in the UK.
Emily, why is self-harming so addictive? Can you give us an explanation about that, please?
Yeah, I think, in some ways it's wonderful that the taboo around self-harm is being broken down. So self-harm is talked about a lot more now than it was, say, 10 years ago, particularly in social media. There's a lot more, websites and information around self-harm. But what that has also done is bring it more into young people's awareness as a way of coping with stress. So a lot of young people I work with will say, I first started self-harming because I knew my friend was doing it and I tried it and it worked. So that, you know, in the same way that teenagers have always experimented with different things that make them feel good, like drink and drugs and being promiscuous and doing dangerous, risky things that give them that rush. Self-harm has come more into that realm. You know, more young people are more aware of it. And the reason it works, as young people often tell me, is that when the body is injured in some way, so whenever, you know, however we're injured, we have this survival mechanism kick in where a huge amount of endorphins, and specifically endogenous opiates, which have the same effect in the bloodstream as heroin, so a huge feeling of relief, euphoria, letting go. This feeling is released when somebody self-injures. So in terms of our survival, that's so that we could get out of a situation and survive, you know. But obviously that's the mechanism that can be abused in self-injury. And once someone has realised that that effect can happen, and you know, a lot of young people I work with will say it's like just calming down and releasing, you know. And often if it's a cut, you know, the sight of the blood will instantly calm them down because they have that release and that hit of endogenous opiates. And of course, because of that mechanism, it can be highly addictive. You know, like any other, when we introduce any chemical to our body, to our bloodstream, that mechanism can be highly addictive. And of course, you know, like with any addiction, what goes alongside that is tolerance.
Yes, indeed.
So just as, you know, when you're 12 and you have half a beer, you're absolutely, you know, on cloud nine. You know, by the time you're 25, you're needing to drink a bottle of vodka. So it's exactly the same with self-injury, that can be a pathway if intervention isn't put in the right way.
I know, Emily, that you make a distinction between self-harm as stress release and as an attempt at suicide. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's really important, I think. There is a correlation between self-harm and suicide in that the statistics suggest that if you get to the point where you're admitted into hospital with a self-injury, so we're talking about, you know, thinking about that continuum right down the end of the continuum, the most extreme situations where someone is completely overwhelmed with emotions that they can't find another way to control at the time. In that instance, when somebody's admitted into hospital, it increases their likelihood of committing suicide by about 100 times. That's about 100 times more likely that they'd kill themselves in the following year. And the reason for that is that obviously the step from very severe self-injury to suicide is much smaller once you've kind of crossed that boundary of really harming yourself in that way. But having said that, it's also extremely important to make the distinction between self-harm and suicide. And something that's very difficult but absolutely essential is that when we're working with someone who, or you know, we're involved in some way as a carer or a parent with someone who's self-injuring, and if it is on that more severe level, that we always ask, you know, was this a way of coping, self-harm, or were you trying to kill yourself? Because in my experience, particularly in the NHS, where risk assessments are very high profile, you know, anyone that self-harms with a risk assessment, the assumption can often be made that a severe self-injury, you know, severe active self-injury is a suicide attempt, when in actual fact, for that person, it's about staying alive.
Any parent, of course, would be highly alarmed if they suspected that their child was self-injuring. So what tips can you give them?
Okay, yeah. I mean, of course, for any parent, it's so distressing when if they find out that their child is willfully harming themselves. And I think, you know, as a parent myself, if I found out my daughter was harming herself, I'd want her to stop. And that emotional response, I think, is completely natural, but can lead to some quite unhelpful approaches when a parent just wants their child to stop very naturally. What the research around self-harm shows is that trying to tell someone to just stop doesn't work. In the same way that trying to tell an alcoholic to stop drinking or a drug addict to stop taking, it just doesn't work. That actually what we need to do is to be as open and as non-judgmental as possible. So we need to find a way of managing our emotions as a parent, and in my book there's some tips around that, of just keeping your emotional arousal down so that you can be as clear thinking with your child as possible, and to create that atmosphere where they feel they can trust you to be able to talk about what's going on, and to really be aiming your attention not at the self-harming behaviour, which of course is where you want your attention to be because you want to help them, but to go below the self-harming behaviour and to find out what it is that's going on with your child that's leading them into that behaviour. So looking at, as a human givens therapist, we talk a lot about emotional needs, what our emotional needs are, and to really look at how are their emotional needs being met or not met. To talk to them about that when you realise what those are, and to think about how their life is running, what it is that's not working for them, and to support them with that. But trying to do that in a very open, gentle way, and realising that self-harm may be something that they might use for a little while, and to be able to find a way of minimising the harm around that. So that might be a little bit about finding out what they're using, if they're self-injuring, making sure that they're not using old rusty implements, that they're as clean and safe as possible. Maybe looking at first aid, making sure they know how to take care of their wounds. So minimising the harm around it, but also making sure that they feel safe to talk to you, and to sort of gently over time help them find other ways of coping. Again, in my book there's lots of sort of tips around that, to replace the self-harming activity with something that's less harmful but can release emotions, but to really respect that might take a while, and to know that the way to keep your child safest is to create that warm, non-judgmental atmosphere, not to try and say you mustn't do it, if you do it this is going to happen, I'm going to take this away, checking their room for anything sharp. Research shows that doesn't work. What it actually does is make it much more dangerous, because the young person is then hiding it, and doing it in a way that's maybe much less safe.
So a parent might actually do well getting support for themselves, how to support their child.
Exactly.
By what you say.
Yeah.
So then finally the self-harming teenager, what can he or she do? What advice would you have for them?
Okay. Well, I think in a way similar advice to the parent, that obviously we know that self-harm is a symptom of things not going right in their life. So for them to access some help, whether that's professional counselling or online help through Life Signs or other organisations like that, but to have a space where they can really look at what it is that's going on in my life, what's not working, is the trauma from the past that needs to be dealt with, are there emotions in the here and now that I need to find another way of releasing, to maybe have some professional help to be able to start dealing with that. One of the key things I've found with helping people out of the self-harm cycle is to find a way of breaking that addictive cycle. So when the urge for self-harm comes on, to be armed with some techniques to actually break that cycle. Because every time a young person imagines and has that urge to self-harm, they're setting off that expectation, which we know, physiologically we're getting a shot of dopamine with that, which is gearing us up for action.
Yeah.
So we have to find a way to not action the self-harm, but find a way of releasing that emotion in some other way. So there's lots of different techniques that one can use. Having something like, a really good friend that you can just phone in that moment and talk through, or do some physical exercise to burn off that adrenaline.
The action, yes.
The action, exactly. So, doing some star jumps or running fast on the spot, something to just burn off that adrenaline. Or having some other sort of release, like putting some music on and screaming along really loudly to just bring that adrenaline down so that the young person can start thinking again. Because what we know, of course, is that when we're fueled with emotion and adrenaline and cortisol, we can't think. Our emotional brain's in charge. Our thinking brain isn't there. So we have to find a way of bringing our emotional arousal down so that we can actually start putting some of those techniques into place, start distracting ourselves, start maybe writing down what we're feeling, talking to somebody who's going to be understanding.
Very helpful, these practical tips. And on the website there will be your self-management plan, which you've kindly made available so that people can really have that to resort to very quickly. But in your book too, do you have a section at all that could be helpful for a person suffering?
Yeah, there's a section on breaking unhelpful habits, which is particularly around that, so particularly around breaking that cycle. And also the whole thing, you know, a sort of driving theme throughout the book is about meeting emotional needs. And in my work particularly with women, and I worked in a women's service with women who had long histories of self-harm and did recover, did come out of that cycle. What I really found made the difference for them was to get their emotional needs met in their life, to have a sense of belonging, to have a sense of connection with people, to have a sense that they were respected in the world, that they mattered, to have a sense of achievement, that once they started getting those needs met, the self-harm just melted away. There wasn't a place for it anymore, you know.
Isn't that reassuring?
Yeah. And that's a big drive why I feel so passionate about this subject, because I've seen people who had really been given up on, you know, teams that referred them into our service had said, you know, I don't think there's much hope, but you know, these women recovered, they got better. And I think it's just applying those principles, you know, in much less severe situations, that we have these emotional needs and we need to get them met, otherwise we resort to things that are unhelpful, including self-harm.
Very important, your approach, and particularly the way that you place this as a symptom within a context. Thank you.